In the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa, in the summer of 1941, the German Wehrmacht was not just an army, it was a force of nature. It was the single most professional, experienced, and confident military machine on Earth. Its armored spearheads, the Panzergruppen, had just conquered all of Western Europe. They were a perfectly oiled machine, a symphony of combined arms, built around two tanks, the Panzer III and the Panzer IV. These were, the Germans believed, the finest fighting vehicles in the world. They were reliable, their optics were superb, and their five-man crews were trained to perfection. As they crossed the Soviet border, this belief was confirmed. The Germans encountered a disorganized, badly led, and terrified Red Army. The main Soviet tanks they met were the T-26 and the BT-7. They were small, lightly armored, and pathetically undergunned. The German 3.7-centimeter anti-tank guns, the Pak-36, cut through them like paper. The tankers gave this gun a grimly humorous nickname, the door knocker, because it would just knock on the door of any tank and the crew would have to come out. For the first few weeks, Barbarossa was not a war, it was a rout. The German High Command was convinced the subhuman Soviets were incapable of building anything of value. The entire campaign, they believed, would be over in 6 weeks. Then, on October 8, 1941, near the town of Emtsensk, this entire fantasy of technological and racial superiority came to a sudden, grinding, and terrifying halt. The 4th Panzer Division, part of General Heinz Guderian's unstoppable armored group, was advancing when its lead elements ran into an unknown force of Soviet tanks. The German Panzers and their supporting Pak-36 anti-tank guns opened fire, and nothing happened. The 3.7-centimeter shells, which had terrified all of Europe, simply bounced off the new Soviet tanks. They ricocheted off the tank's bizarre, sharply angled frontal armor, like throwing peas at a wall, as one gunner described. The Panzers, in a panic, opened up with their own short-barreled cannons. Their shells, too, bounced off. The Soviet tanks, unbothered by the storm of useless steel hitting them, simply rolled forward. They opened fire with their own massive-looking 76mm guns, and the German Panzer IIIs and IVs began to explode, one by one. The Soviet tanks then drove over the German anti-tank guns, crushing them and their crews into the mud. The seemingly invincible 4th Panzer Division was not just stopped, it was routed. A horrified Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, flew to the front to see this new weapon for himself. He inspected the battlefield, littered with the burning wrecks of his own panzers. A new Soviet machine, he wrote in his diary that night, was the T-34, and his conclusion was a moment of sheer ice-cold panic that should have echoed all the way back to Berlin. Up to this point, he wrote, "We had enjoyed tank superiority, but now the situation was reversed. A very grave new reality had emerged. This was the T-34 shock, the Panzer Schreck." It was the moment the German army, at the height of its power, realized that its entire doctrine, its technology, and its assumptions were suddenly and horrifyingly obsolete. The T-34, which the Germans were now encountering in growing numbers, was not just a good tank. It was, in 1941, the most revolutionary and important tank in the world. And it was revolutionary for 3 specific reasons that the Germans had completely failed to anticipate. The first was its armor. The T-34 was the first mass-produced tank in history to feature sloped armor on all sides. This was a concept of pure geometric genius. The armor on the front of the tank was only 45mm thick, less than the frontal armor on some German panzers. But it was sloped back at a 60-degree angle. This simple angle did 2 things. First, it increased the line of sight thickness. A Pak-36 shell, hitting that 45mm plate, had to travel through almost 90mm of steel to penetrate it, effectively doubling its armor thickness. Second, and more importantly, the slope meant that most incoming shells would not hit flat on. They would hit at an angle and deflect, or ricochet, harmlessly off into the sky. This was the shot trap that Guderian's man had just experienced. The T-34 was a geometric fortress, designed not just to absorb a hit, but to defeat it before it even landed. The second revolution was its gun. While the German panzers were still using small, short-barreled 50mm or 75mm guns designed to fight infantry, the T-34 was armed with a high-velocity L11 76.2mm cannon. This was a massive, dual-purpose gun that could fire a high-explosive shell that was twice as powerful as the Panzer IVs, obliterating anti-tank guns and infantry, but it could also fire an armor-piercing rounds that could, and did, kill every single German tank on the battlefield in 1941, often from over 1,000 yards away. The third revolution, and perhaps the most important, was its mobility. The Germans had designed their Panzers for the good roads of France and Western Europe. They had narrow, bicycle-like tracks. But Russia had no roads. It had the Rasputitsa, the time without roads, a sea of deep, clinging mud in the fall and spring, and deep, powdery snow in the winter. The German Panzers, with their high ground pressure, would sink up to their bellies, instantly becoming immobile, easy targets. The T-34, by contrast, had been designed for this. It used a Christie suspension system, giving it rugged, independent wheel movement, and, crucially, it had 20-inch wide Bainmore tracks. These massive, wide tracks were like snowshoes. They spread the tank's 26-ton weight so perfectly that it had a lower ground pressure than a German infantryman. As Guderian's Panzers were sinking in the mud, the T-34s were floating right over it, running circles around them. And finally, there was the engine. It was a V2 500 horsepower, all aluminum diesel engine. The Germans, and the rest of the world, used gasoline engines. Gasoline is volatile. It ignites instantly when hit, a phenomenon that gave German tankers the grim nickname crispy critters. Diesel fuel, by contrast, is far less flammable. It is a heavy oil. You can drop a lit match into a bucket of it, and it will go out. This meant T-34s could take hits that would turn a Panzer into a fireball and simply keep fighting. Furthermore, the diesel engine was more fuel efficient, giving the T-34 an operational range of over 180 miles, nearly double that of the Panzer IV. Sloped armor that was immune to German guns, a cannon that could kill any German tank, and an engine and track system that made it master of the mud and snow. This was the weapon that Guderian met in Sensk. It was not a crude machine. It was a perfect machine, designed for the exact war it was about to fight, and the Germans had nothing that could stop it. The shockwave from Sensk was not an isolated event. It was a contagion of fear. It traveled all the way from Heinz Guderian's frozen command post to Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in Rastenburg. Guderian was not alone. General Paul von Kleist, commander of the 1st Panzer Army, a man not prone to exaggeration, sent his own, even more dire report. He called the T-34 the finest tank in the world, and stated flatly that his men were badly frightened by it. Reports from the front lines became a litany of terror. German anti-tank gunners, the Panzerjägers, who had previously been the cocky masters of the battlefield, were now abandoning their positions and running when they saw the T-34's distinctive, stooping silhouette. Their door knocker. Pak-36 guns were worse than useless. They were a death sentence, serving only to reveal the gunner's position before he was annihilated. This was not just a crisis, it was an existential threat. The entire German theory of warfare, built on a foundation of unassailable technological superiority, was collapsing. In their characteristically methodical, if shocked way, the German High Command responded not with blind panic, but with engineering. In November 1941, they assembled a Panzer Commission. This was a dream team of Germany's top tank designers, engineers, and industrialists. Men from Porsche, Henschel, MAN, and Daimler-Benz were pulled from their factories, flown to Guderian's headquarters at Army Group Center, and tasked with a single urgent mission: capture, dissect, and understand his new Soviet weapon. They were to analyze its strengths, its weaknesses, and, most importantly, provide an answer to a terrifying question: how, in secret, had a nation they considered to be a primitive, subhuman, rebel managed to create a weapon that was a full generation ahead of their own? When the German engineers got their hands on their first captured T-34s, their initial overriding reaction was not one of fear, it was one of profound, professional disgust. To their eyes, trained in the high art of precision, German manufacturing, where every weld was a work of art, and every component was machined to 1,000th of an inch, the T-34 was a piece of junk. It was, in their words, crude, primitive, and barbaric. And on the surface, they were right. The weld seams on the armor were not clean, smooth, and ground down. They were rough, sloppy, and visibly caked with slag, as if they'd been put together by an amateur. The steel plate itself was badly finished, with visible casting marks and imperfections. When they looked inside the tank, their horror grew. The crew compartment was not a clean, organized, cream-painted, ergonomic fighting space like in a Panzer IV. It was a cramped, filthy, oil-streaked nightmare. The noise from the V2 diesel engine was so deafening that the crew couldn't even speak to each other. They had to communicate with hand signals and a primitive system of colored lights. The ventilation was abysmal, filling the cabin with toxic repellent fumes after just a few shots. The transmission, they found, was a brutal piece of 1920s era engineering, a crash gearbox with no synchromesh. The driver didn't just shift gears, he had to fight the tank with a heavy hammer and a pry bar, a process that often broke his wrist or exhausted him to the point of collapse. The air filters for the magnificent V2 engine were so badly designed, made of what looked like horsehair and steel wool, that they allowed dust, grit, and mud to be sucked directly into the cylinders. This meant that while the engine itself was a masterpiece, it was often destroyed from the inside out after just a few hundred miles of cross-country driving. And worst of all, they discovered the turret. The German Panzers had, from the beginning, perfected the revolutionary three-man turret: a commander, a gunner, and a loader. This was a hunter-killer team. The commander's only job was to stand in his cupola, scan the battlefield with his binoculars, find targets, and command. But the T-34 had a small, cramped, two-man turret. The tank's commander was also the gunner. This meant he had to do two full-time, high-stress jobs at once. He had to hunch over the crude telescopic sight, aiming and firing the main gun, while also trying to peek through a tiny, primitive periscope to see the battlefield and command his driver. It was a tactical disaster. It meant the T-34 was, in effect, blind. Finally, most of the tanks didn't even have a radio. Only the platoon commander's tank had one. The rest of the crews were expected to follow signal flags, like cavalry from the Napoleonic Wars, in the middle of a swirling, chaotic tank battle. The German Panzer Commission, looking at this long, damning list of flaws, came to a very comforting and very wrong conclusion. They wrote in their report that the T-34 was a typical example of crude Bolshevik technology. They believed this inferior machine had achieved its success only through mass, and that its revolutionary features, the sloped armor, the wide tracks, were a lucky accident, a fluke of genius from an otherwise primitive society. And this, right here, was the single greatest German intellectual failure of the entire war. They saw the crude welds, but they failed to understand what they meant. They meant the tank could be welded together by a semi-skilled factory worker, a woman, or a teenager, not a master craftsman who took years to train. They saw the sloppy finish, but they failed to understand it meant the tank could be built fast. They saw the terrible two-man turret and the awful transmission, but they failed to understand that the Soviets knew these were flaws. The T-34 was not a finished product. It was a philosophy. It was a concept of proletarian design. A design that was deliberately, brilliantly, simple enough to be mass-produced by the tens of thousands. It was a design meant to be built in factories that were, at that very moment, being disassembled, loaded onto flat cars, and rebuilt in the snow east of the Ural Mountains. The German engineers saw a list of problems to be fixed. The Soviet designers, led by the tragically unheralded Mikhail Koshkin, saw a solution to a strategic reality. The Soviets knew they didn't need one perfect tank with perfect ergonomics and a perfect transmission to win the war. They needed 50,000 good enough tanks that could be driven by a farmer, repaired in a frozen field with a hammer, and, most importantly, be at the battle. The German Panzer Commission returned to Germany with two fateful recommendations. The first, from Daimler-Benz, was most logical. Copy the T-34. Exactly. They argued it was a perfect balance of mobility, protection, and firepower. And its obvious flaws, like the two-man turret, could be easily fixed. But this idea was rejected. It was rejected by the German High Command and by Hitler himself. Why? Because it was un-German. So, they chose the second option. We will take their ideas, the sloped armor, the long gun, but we will build them our way. We will build a German version, a better version. It will be a masterpiece of engineering, with a perfect three-man turret, a revolutionary new suspension, a smooth transmission, and flawless ice optics. It will be complex. It will be heavy. It will be perfect. This decision, made in the winter of 1941, set the two nations on two completely different and irreversible paths. It was the decision that would ultimately doom the German Panzerwaffe, It was the decision that gave birth to the Panzer V, the Panther, and all the logistical nightmares that came with it. The German decision in the winter of 1941 to not copy the T-34 is one of the single most important strategic blunders of the Second World War. By rejecting the T-34's philosophy of simple, mass-producible, good-enough engineering, the Germans committed themselves to a path that would, ultimately, bleed their entire war machine dry. They chose to fight a war of quality against an enemy who had mastered the art of quantity. Their answer to the T-34 was not a tank. It was a pair of masterpieces. The Panzer V, the Panther, was a brilliant design. It directly copied the T-34's sloped armor and mounted a long, high-velocity 75mm gun that was arguably the best tank cannon of the war. But it was a German masterpiece, which meant it was complex. It weighed 45 tons, was mechanically fussy, and featured a new interleaved bogey suspension that, while providing a smooth ride, was a maintenance nightmare. A single broken road wheel on the inside meant a repair crew had to remove 5 other wheels just to get to it, a task that could take days in the frozen mud. And then there was the Panzer VI, the Tiger. The Tiger was a monster. It was a 57-ton mobile fortress, armed with a legendary 88mm cannon. Its 100mm thick frontal armor was, in 1942 and early 1943, completely immune to every Allied and Soviet tank gun on the battlefield. But it was a resource-devouring behemoth. It consumed a gallon of fuel for every mile it traveled. It broke down constantly, and it was so heavy it couldn't cross most European bridges, forcing its crews to find a shallow river ford, a process that took hours. The Germans were now building the equivalent of handcrafted Swiss watches. But the Soviets were not building watches, they were building clocks. And they were building them in a place the Germans could not reach. While the German designers were agonizing over perfect transmissions, the Soviets were performing the single greatest feat of industrial migration in human history. As the Wehrmacht advanced in 1941, Stalin gave the order to evacuate the heart of Soviet industry. The entire Kharkiv locomotive factory, Factory Number 183, the birthplace of the T-34, was disassembled, loaded onto 38,000 railway flat cars, and shipped over 1,000 miles to the east. It was rebuilt in the dead of winter, in the snow-covered Ural Mountains, in a city called Nizhny Tagil. This new, sprawling complex of factories, powered by evacuated workers living in log cabins, became known as Tankograd, Tank City. And here, the crude philosophy of the T-34 became a strategic war winner, because the tank was designed to be built by semi-skilled workers, because its welds were allowed to be sloppy, because its armor plates were designed to be cast in simple molds and not perfectly machined. Tankograd could do something the German factories could not. It could achieve scale. The numbers tell the real story. In 1943, the peak of its production, Germany, with all the industrial might of conquered Europe, managed to build a total of 5,966 Panzer IVs, Panthers, and Tigers. In that same year, Tankograd and the other Soviet factories operating in the snow churned out over 15,700 T-34s. At the peak of production, over 1,000 T-34s were rolling off the assembly lines every single month. The Germans, in their best month ever in 1944, only managed to produce 354 Panthers. The Germans were fighting a war of arithmetic that they were mathematically guaranteed to lose. But this brutal math came at a terrible human cost. And it is here that the myth of the T-34 must be separated from the reality. The T-34 of 1942 and 1943 was not a good tank to be in. In fact, it was a death trap. The German engineers had been right. The two-man turret was a tactical disaster. The T-34's commander, who was also the gunner, was overworked, blind, and ineffective. His optics were, by German standards, garbage. A German gunner in a Tiger, using his crystal clear Zeiss optics, could see a target, identify it, and destroy it from 2,000 yards away. The T-34 commander, squinting through a cloudy, often yellow-tinted periscope, was lucky to see 800 yards. The crude armor finishing wasn't just ugly, it was brittle. The sloppy welds would often crack when hit by a German shell, even if the shell didn't penetrate. This created spalling. The shell's impact would send a dinner plate-sized chunk of the inside armor, white hot, flying around the crew compartment, decapitating the driver or the loader. The ventilation was non-existent. After firing 3 or 4 shots, the cabin would fill with a thick, choking, toxic cloud of propellant smoke, leaving the crew blind, gagging, and vomiting. And most of the tanks still lacked a radio. This was the hell of being in a T-34. The average life expectancy of a new tank and its crew in the battles in 1942 was, in some cases, less than 14 hours of combat. The Soviets were winning, but they were winning by sacrificing thousands of men and thousands of tanks, paying a horrific blood price for their flawed but available weapon. This horrifying dynamic, German quality versus Soviet quantity, came to its fiery apocalyptic climax in July 1943 at the Battle of Kursk. This was the great showdown. The Germans unleashed their new Panthers and their Tiger battalions, and for the first time, the T-34-76 was no longer the king. It was the underdog. Its 76mm gun, which had been a god in 1941, was now useless. It could not penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger at any combat range. It could only penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at point-blank range. The T-34 crews, in a desperate reversal of tactics, were now the ones forced into suicidal Wolfpack charges. Their orders were to drive as fast as they could at the Tigers, ignoring their own losses just to get close enough to try and hit their thin side or rear armor. This was the reality of the greatest tank battle in history, at Prokhorovka. It was a massacre. The T-34s were charging headlong into the guns of the German Tigers, who sat untouchable and picked them off like targets in a shooting gallery. The Soviets were trading 5, 6, even 10 T-34s for every one Tiger they managed to kill. The Germans were winning the tactical battle. Their perfect tanks were working, but they were losing the war. They were losing tanks they could not replace, and they were killing tanks the Soviets could. And in the aftermath of Kursk, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, had its own moment of realization. The T-34 shock was over. Their wonder weapon was now suddenly obsolete. A German High Command, faced with this, would have immediately started designing a Panzer VII or a Panzer VIII, a whole new complex 5-year project. But the Soviets, guided by their brilliant pragmatic proletarian design philosophy, did something else. They looked at the problem. The T-34 chassis was still perfect. The V2 diesel engine was perfect. The wide tracks were perfect. The idea of the T-34 was sound. It just needed a bigger gun and a better turret. The Soviet response to the crisis at Kursk was a masterpiece of pragmatism. The designers at Tankograd were not told to invent a new wonder weapon. They were told to fix the T-34. And they were told to do it now. The core of the tank, the chassis, the V2 diesel engine, the wide tracks, and the sloped frontal armor was still revolutionary. The problem was the turret. It was cramped, blind, and its gun was now a pea shooter. The solution was not a new tank, it was an upgrade. It was the T-34-85. First, and most importantly, they solved the single greatest flaw that had plagued the tank since 1941. They designed a new, much larger turret ring. This allowed them to build a new, spacious, 3-man turret. At last, the T-34 had a dedicated tank commander. The commander's only job was to stand in his new all-around vision cupola and command. He would find the targets while his gunner aimed and his loader loaded. This one simple, uncrewed upgrade, which the Germans had possessed from the beginning, instantly multiplied the T-34's battlefield effectiveness by a factor of 10. The tank, which had been blind, could now see. Second, into this new, larger turret, they mounted a new, more powerful gun. It was the 85mm Mi-9-44 ZSS S-53 cannon. This was a fantastic weapon, a direct derivative of a proven anti-aircraft gun. It was a high-velocity cannon that fired a heavy, armor-piercing round, and it could kill Tigers and Panthers. Not just from the side, like the old gun, but from the front, at combat ranges of over 1,000 yards. The playing field, which had been tilted so disastrously at Kursk, was suddenly and violently leveled. And now came the final, war-winning miracle of the proletarian design philosophy. How long did it take the Soviets to design this new war-changing turret, test it, and get it into production? It did not take them 2 years, like the German Panther. It took them 4 months. Because the T-34 was designed to be adaptable, the new, larger turret ring could be fitted onto the existing T-34 chassis, right on the same assembly lines at Tankograd. They didn't have to shut down production. They didn't have to retool their entire industry. They simply started making the new one. In December of 1943, just 5 months after the disaster at Kursk, the first T-34-85s were rolling off the assembly lines and heading to the front. This was the final fatal contrast with the Germans. When the Germans met the T-34, their response was to design the 45-ton Panther. When the Soviets met the Panther, their response was to upgrade the T-34. The Germans had created a new, complex, and unreliable weapon that cost a fortune and required entirely new factories and supply chains. The Soviets had created a better version of the tank they already had, and they built it in the same factories, using the same parts, the same engine, and the same workers. In 1944, the war on the Eastern Front was no longer a war of German quality versus Soviet quantity. It was now a war of German quality versus Soviet quality and quantity. The T-34-85 was the ultimate good enough weapon. Was it, one-on-one, as good as a Panther? No. The Panther's 75mm gun had better optics and a higher velocity. The Panther's frontal armor was thicker. But the T-34-85 was 10 tons lighter. It was faster. It was mechanically reliable, and it could be fixed in a field with a hammer and a wrench. A Panther, when its complex transmission or suspension failed, was just a 45-ton steel pillbox, waiting to be towed back to a factory. A factory that was, by 1944, being pulverized by American bombers. This was the new reality that the Germans faced in Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. They were no longer fighting blind, suicidal, radioless T-34s. They were fighting T-34-85s, crewed by veterans. These were men who had survived Kursk, who had learned their trade, and who were now confident, experienced, and angry. And they were coming, not in waves of 10, but in armies of thousands. For every one Panther that the Germans could get to the front, the Soviets would meet it with 15 T-34-85s. The Panther might kill 5 of them. It might kill 10, but it could not kill all 15. And the 5 that survived would close in, swarm it from the flanks, and tear it to pieces. The Germans, in their obsessive, arrogant pursuit of perfection, had created a tank, the Panther, that was a masterpiece. But it was a logistical nightmare. The Soviets, in their pragmatic pursuit of good enough, had created a tank that was merely excellent, but it was a logistical dream. The T-34 was the weapon that won the war. The final legacy of the T-34 is not found in its statistics, but in its influence. The T-34 shock of 1941 was the moment of realization that broke the German Panzerwaffe. It was the catalyst. It was the weapon that so terrified the German High Command that it forced them to abandon their own proven, reliable designs, the Panzer III and Panzer IV, and embark on a desperate, self-defeating arms race. It forced them to build the complex, overweight, and resource-devouring big cats, the Tiger and the Panther. And these perfect tanks, which were the answer to the T-34, were precisely what cost Germany the war. They consumed all of Germany's steel, all of its fuel, and all of its engineering genius, and there were never enough of them. The T-34 was not just a tank. It was a philosophy. It was a philosophy of proletarian design, of ruthless pragmatism, of mass production, and of constant, rapid adaptation. It was a philosophy that understood that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And in the brutal, grinding, 4-year war of attrition on the Eastern Front, it was the philosophy of good enough, produced by the tens of thousands that ultimately drove all the way to Berlin and crushed the philosophy of perfect, which was still waiting in a factory for a spare part. In May of 1945, the final symbolic image of the war in Europe was not a politician signing a treaty. It was the sight of 2,000 T-34-85 tanks, covered in exhausted, grime-faced Red Army soldiers smashing their way through the ruins of Berlin. They were the steel spearhead that had, in full bloody years, driven from the gates of Moscow all the way to the heart of the Reich. The T-34, the tank born from the Panzerstreck of 1941, had become the tank of siege of victory. But for the T-34, the story was not over. It was just beginning. While the German Wehrmacht was dead, A new, far more powerful rival was now on the scene: the United States Army. And as the Iron Curtain began to fall, Western military analysts, in a moment of calm, sober, post-war reflection, finally got to do what the German Panzer Commission had done in 1941. They got their hands on the T-34-85. And this time, they weren't just comparing it to a flawed Panther. They were comparing it to their own war winner, the M4 Sherman. On the surface, the comparison was almost a caricature of the two nations. The M4 Sherman was tall, over 2 feet taller than the T-34, presenting a huge, inviting target. Its armor was mostly vertical, not sloped. It ran on a gasoline engine that, in early models, earned it the terrifying nickname, the Ronson, after the lighter slogan, "Lights up the first time, every time." But inside, the Sherman was, by Soviet standards, a palace. It was spacious. It was ergonomic. Its 3-man turret was efficient. It had a revolutionary gyroscopic gun stabilizer that allowed it to fire on the move with incredible accuracy. And, like the T-34, it was a masterpiece of mass production. The Americans had built nearly 50,000 of them. The T-34-85 was the opposite. It was crude. It was cramped. Its finish was terrible. Its optics were still cloudy. But it had the sloped armor. It had the low profile. It had the wide tracks. And it had the fuel-efficient, safe diesel engine. As Western designers studied the T-34, they had their own moment of realization. The T-34, they concluded, was not just a medium tank. It was something new. It was a universal tank. It had the mobility of a cavalry tank, the armor of an infantry tank, and a firepower that, in its day, rivaled heavy tanks. It was the T-34, not any of their own designs, that had truly created the concept of the main battle tank, or M. B. T. The single, do-it-all design that would dominate the next 75 years of warfare. The Soviet designers, the inheritors of Koshkin's legacy, knew this, and they did not stop. While the Americans were decommissioning their factories, the Soviets, guided by their philosophy of constant, rapid adaptation, were already evolving their masterpiece. They looked at the T-34-85 and began to fix its last remaining flaws, even as it was still in production. The result in 1944 was the T-44. It was, in essence, a perfected T-34. It used the same V2 diesel engine, but mounted it transversely sideways in the hull. This brilliant, simple change saved a massive amount of internal space, allowing the designers to move the turret to the center of the tank, improve the driver's hatch, and, most importantly, apply much thicker frontal armor. But the T-44 was just a stepping stone. In 1947, they took this new, improved T-44 chassis, and they added a new, massive 100mm cannon. The result was the T-54. This was the T-34's true heir. The T-54, and its direct descendant, the T-55, would go on to become the most produced tank in human history. Over 100,000 of them were built. The T-54 was the T-34's philosophy. Made perfect, it was cheap to build, simple to operate, had a devastatingly powerful gun, a low, hard-to-hit profile, and it was everywhere. The proletarian design that the Germans had scoffed at had just given birth to the single most successful tank family on Earth. The entire vast armored force of the Warsaw Pact and dozens of other nations from the Middle East to Asia would be built on the direct genetic descendant of the T-34. While the Soviets were evolving their design, the West had to start over. The Americans had to rush the M26 Pershing into production. The British had to design the Centurion, all of their new post-war M. B-T designs were, in one way or another, a direct answer to the T-34's legacy. But the T-34-85 itself was not ready for a museum. It had a second life to live. On June 25, 1950, the T-34 shock happened all over again. The North Korean People's Army, equipped with 150 brand new Soviet-supplied T-34-85s, stormed across the 38th parallel. The U.S. Army troops stationed in South Korea were, in a terrifying repeat of 1941, completely and totally unprepared. The Americans had no heavy tanks in Korea. Their only armor was the M24 Chaffee light tank. The Chaffee's 75mm gun, which was considered good enough for the Pacific, bounced off the T-34's sloped frontal armor. The T-34's 85mm cannon, by contrast, would slice a Chaffee in half from a mile away. The American infantry, armed with their old 2.36-inch bazookas from World War II, discovered with horror that their rockets also failed to penetrate the T-34's armor. It was Motzinsk all over again. American GIIs, just like the German Panzerjägers 9 years earlier, began to panic and run. The T-34s seemed, once again, to be an invincible superweapon, and they spearheaded the near-total conquest of the Korean peninsula. It was not until the U.S. Army, in a desperate fire brigade, action rushed its own World War II veterans, the M-26 Pershing and the M4A38, EZ-8 Sherman to the Pusan perimeter, that the T-34-85 finally met its match. The EZ-8, with its new high-velocity 76mm gun, could finally kill a T-34. The T-34 shock of Korea was, for a third time, a victory of a good enough weapon over an army that was simply unprepared for it. The T-34 story continued. It fought in Vietnam. It fought in the deserts of the Middle East, in the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. It fought in Angola. It fought in the civil wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. A T-34 was, in fact, photographed in 2024, over 80 years after its design, allegedly being used by Russian-backed forces in Ukraine. This is the final, undeniable legacy of the T-34. It was the tank that defeated Hitler, but it was also the tank that defined the 20th century. Its crude design philosophy, a philosophy of simplicity, reliability, adaptability, and mass production, evolved, outproduced, and outlasted all of its perfect masterpiece rivals. The Germans had laughed at it, and the T-34, in its various forms, had simply rolled right over them, and just kept rolling for the next 80 years.